I had just settled into the familiar burgundy chair at my parents' dining table, the sunlight spilling through the bay windows, when the aroma of roast beef and fresh herbs reminded me why Sunday lunches were my anchor in a chaotic family life. I'm Marion Kingsley, 62, retired architect, and a woman who has always valued control over her own space. Calm and meticulous by nature, I had built my life carefully, my career, my finances. My lake house and I intended to keep it that way. Across the table, my parents, Linda and Richard, had already carved their usual routines into the afternoon. Mom, 85, fussed over the placement of silverware and the angle of the napkins, her gentle but insistent perfectionism still evident in every gesture. Dad, 88, settled into his usual spot at the head of the table, straight-backed and deliberate, offering small smiles that rarely reached his eyes. Their years of experience and subtle influence had shaped my life in ways I had long ago accepted. Even when it frustrated me, Ethan, my 35-year-old son, slid into his chair beside me with casual ease, his hair slightly rumpled from the drive over. Married for 10 years, confident in his own life. He still carried traces of the boy who had once idolized my approval. He leaned back, fork in hand, and spoke with a tone so casual that my fork paused mid-air. "We're moving into your lake house next week," he said, smiling as if he were sharing a trivial piece of news. "My mother-in-law already approved." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. The lake house, my sanctuary, my investment, my refuge after years of rebuilding my life, suddenly felt violated. Shock rooted me to my chair. I could feel the tension coil in my shoulders, the sudden tightness in my chest. How could Ethan, and by extension, his mother assume they had any right to simply move in? My mind raced through every renovation, every dollar spent, every sleepless night I had poured into that house. I looked from Ethan to my parents, who exchanged subtle glances, the same ones they had used for decades whenever family plans excluded me. A sense of disbelief mingled with a sharp surge of indignation. Boundaries that I had painstakingly maintained were being disregarded in a single, offhand announcement. I lowered my fork slowly, setting it beside my plate, and let my eyes travel over the room, the polished wood, the sunlight on crystal glasses, the familiarity now tinged with an unexpected threat. I knew, deep down, that this Sunday lunch would mark the beginning of a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. The words "we're moving into your lake house" kept replaying in my mind long after lunch ended. The lake house wasn't just a property. It was the culmination of 15 years of persistence, meticulous planning, and countless sacrifices. 15 years ago, I had purchased the modest, weathered property for $515,000, drawn not by its imperfections, but by the potential I saw reflected in its cracked windows and peeling paint. Each weekend since had been an exercise in vision and endurance, transforming the structure into a home that could withstand the elements and my own turbulent emotions. I remembered the flood 3 years ago, the basement water creeping over the hardwood floors while my parents were vacationing in Florida, blissfully unaware of the damage. While friends and neighbors offered vague sympathy, I had spent days salvaging soaked furniture, drying beams, and replacing sheetrock alone. The cost wasn't only financial, though another $28,000 in emergency repairs had set me back, but deeply personal. That house had become my sanctuary, the first place where I felt free to breathe again after the bitterness of my divorce had threatened to consume me. Each nail I hammered, each coat of paint I brushed, symbolized a step toward reclaiming my life, my autonomy. My eyes swept over the living room, in memory the reclaimed oak floors I had spent weeks sanding, The cozy fireplace I had rebuilt brick by brick. The kitchen counters where I had hosted friends for celebratory dinners when I finally felt whole. This was more than a house. It was the embodiment of every choice I had made to prioritize myself after years of accommodating everyone else. And yet, the entitlement of my family had always lurked nearby, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. I thought of the small loan my sister had requested 6 years ago, $3,000, that somehow ballooned to $18,000 and had never been repaid. I remembered finding the spare key she had secretly copied to my apartment, using it to borrow my shower and personal space without asking. Every incident, from borrowed cars to impromptu stays at my home during vacations, had been framed as family helping family. Now, Ethan and Patricia were presenting the latest iteration of the same pattern, expecting me to surrender what I had built with my own hands and my own heart. I exhaled slowly, the weight of memory pressing against my ribs. Yet alongside it rose clarity. The lake house was mine. Every beam, every floorboard, every decision about color, layout, and security belonged to me alone. The thought of surrendering it, even partially, was intolerable. My mind flicked ahead to potential strategies, to the ways I could assert control without yielding to the casual assumptions of entitlement that had haunted me for decades. This house had carried me through storms, both literal and metaphorical, and I would not allow it to become a footnote in someone else's narrative. The investment of time, money, and soul was too great to be dismissed as trivial. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my authority over my own life, tangible and immovable, and I understood that asserting it would require both precision and resolve. The next morning, I returned to my parents' home to sort through mail and check on details for the upcoming week, but the tension from Sunday's lunch lingered like a storm cloud over the kitchen table. Linda, my mother, hovered over the stack of newspapers, her soft voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who never spoke without purpose. Marion, surely it would make everyone happier if you allowed Ethan and Patricia to stay at the lake house for a few weeks, she said, her eyes glancing toward my father as if seeking silent approval. Richard, steady and deliberate, nodded slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening. "It's only temporary," he added, though the weight behind the words suggested far more than casual encouragement. The subtle pressure was familiar, a lifetime of suggestions wrapped in politeness, always designed to test my limits. Then Patricia Harlow entered the room, her presence commanding attention without effort. She had that particular air of entitlement, a mixture of charm and authority honed over decades. "Marion," she began, voice warm but firm, "we're not asking for a permanent arrangement. It's just a week, and surely family helps family when circumstances are difficult. Don't you want Ethan to feel supported?" She placed a hand lightly on the table, as though the weight of her touch reinforced the gravity of her moral reasoning. Her words were carefully crafted to appeal to every principle I held dear: family loyalty, generosity, responsibility, but I recognized the familiar pattern. I had been tested countless times before, manipulated through moral appeals while my boundaries were quietly eroded. I lifted my chin, steadying my gaze on Patricia, and let my mind shift into planning mode. There was no sudden outburst, no loud confrontation. Instead, I cataloged each past instance of entitlement, each previous concession I had made at the expense of my own autonomy. The flood repairs, the renovations, the times I had lent money or space only to be taken for granted, they all formed a map of leverage I could use now. As the morning unfolded, I resolved to assert control in a way that was precise, deliberate, and undeniable. I would not give in to gentle nudges or carefully framed moral arguments. The lake house was mine, and I intended to ensure that every expectation of intrusion was met with firm, calculated resistance. By mid-morning, I was back at the lake house. The crisp Wisconsin air carrying the scent of pine and the faint tang of the lake. I dialed the contractor I had worked with for years, Miguel, and went over every detail: the foundation repairs, the new security system, the timeline for the upcoming renovations. His calm, methodical voice reassured me as I double-checked dates, permits, and material deliveries. Every piece had been scheduled with precision. Nothing would be left to chance. Next, I walked through the house, clipboard in hand, reviewing building permits I had obtained months earlier. The walls bore the subtle evidence of past floods and repairs. Each nail, beam, and brace a testament to my attention to detail. I ran my fingers over the reclaimed oak floors I had spent weeks sanding, and the freshly painted trim that reflected sunlight in muted golden tones. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were practical measures, all in line with local building codes, ensuring the house was not only beautiful, but legally secure and structurally sound. I moved to the security panel near the entrance, activating the motion sensors and smart locks I had installed last week. A series of beeps confirmed everything was online, each alert a small but tangible line of defense. I imagined the scenario: if Ethan and Patricia arrived without warning, the system would record every step, every attempt at entry. The thought brought a measure of calm and focus to my chest, replacing the tension that had lingered since Sunday. Standing in the center of the living room, I let myself reflect on the years spent restoring this property. Every challenge I had faced: the floods, the renovations, the painstaking repairs had prepared me for this moment. I felt a clarity I hadn't known in years. I would not be caught off guard, and I would not relinquish what I had earned. This house was mine, and I was ready to defend it with foresight and resolve. Chapter 5. Confrontation begins. I hadn't expected them to arrive so early. The quiet of the lake house morning was broken by the low rumble of a car turning onto the gravel drive. I stepped onto the porch, hands resting lightly on the railing, and watched as Ethan's black SUV came to a stop. Patricia was in the passenger seat, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head, a smile that suggested triumph already in place. Before they could even open the doors, the subtle hum of the security system came to life. Motion sensors along the driveway lit up, and the smart locks clicked in sequence. A soft but unmistakable voice from the small speaker announced, "Unauthorized entry detected. Owner notified." I felt a surge of calm in my chest, each alert a tangible reminder that this house was mine to protect. Ethan stepped out first, eyebrows raised, glancing toward Patricia with a mixture of surprise and irritation. Patricia's confident smile faltered as she realized the house wasn't going to yield to their assumptions. "Marion," she called, voice warm but firm. "We just wanted to—" "I understand," I interrupted evenly, stepping down the porch stairs to meet them. "But the property isn't accessible during the renovations." I held up the stack of permits and contracts I had prepared, the paper crisp, dates and signatures clearly visible. "Everything is scheduled. The contractors arrive first thing tomorrow." Their faces shifted, disbelief flickering across Ethan's features and Patricia's practiced composure cracking just enough to reveal impatience. I maintained a steady pace as I walked toward the front gate, letting the security sensors do their work. Every motion, every step they attempted was logged and recorded, and the subtle red lights blinking along the fence made the point in a way words never could. Patricia tried again, stepping forward, her tone adopting the familiar cadence of moral persuasion. "It's just a short visit. Surely family should support each other in times of need." I met her gaze without hesitation, each word deliberate. Family does support each other. This is not a short visit. These renovations are legal, documented, and unavoidable. You will need to make alternative arrangements. My voice was calm, unyielding, and precise. A stark contrast to the expectation that I would yield. Ethan looked between us, the tension rising as the reality settled in their plan to casually move in had failed. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning the house as if calculating another approach. I folded my arms, observing both of them, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the point to land. The house was mine, and every attempt to override that fact would meet the same resistance. By mid-morning, the lake house was buzzing with controlled activity. Miguel and his crew had arrived early, setting up scaffolding along the exterior and placing orange safety cones around the driveway. I watched from the porch as the movers hesitated near the front gate, realizing the access I had meticulously secured was impenetrable. The furniture that Patricia had assumed would be casually placed in the living areas was now either redirected to storage units I had rented in advance or, in the case of certain heirlooms, scheduled for auction with proceeds going to a local foster youth program. Every decision had been logged in my notebook, every call and confirmation documented with timestamps. Ethan stood near the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, confusion and frustration visible in his posture. Patricia, maintaining her composed exterior, now shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the security cameras I had installed just days prior. We just thought it would be easier if she began, but I cut her off gently, yet firmly. "I understand your reasoning," I said, walking down to meet them on level ground. "But convenience does not override ownership. The contractors and security measures are scheduled, and the renovations will proceed without interruption." I motioned toward the interior as Miguel approached, clipboard in hand. "Everything is documented. All permits are current, and the timeline is fixed. Any further attempts to move in without authorization will be recorded and addressed accordingly." Patricia's eyes flickered to the auction notice I had left partially visible on the porch table, her lips tightening as she recognized the consequence of presuming control over my property. Ethan, usually quick to assert himself, hesitated, the weight of my preparation dawning on him. Each move I had orchestrated, every contractor call, every security alert, every documented plan exposed the stark contrast between my foresight and their assumptions. As I walked back toward the porch, I reviewed the day's schedule aloud, confirming deliveries, renovation milestones, and security protocols. The reality was unavoidable. The lake house was firmly under my control. The tension hung thick in the air, yet I maintained a steady, composed demeanor. For the first time, I saw the subtle shift in both Ethan and Patricia, the recognition that this house, this space, was no longer open to casual intrusion. They were facing the consequences of entitlement, and I remained calm, deliberate, and unshaken. Every step of the day reinforced the authority I had claimed. Each documented action a line in the narrative I was determined to write on my own terms. The crunch of gravel beneath the tires announced the arrival of my parents. Linda and Richard stepped carefully from their car, their eyes scanning the lake house, the construction equipment, and the neatly stacked materials I had organized for the renovations. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of tension as they moved across the yard, their usual confidence tempered by the unmistakable order of my preparations. "Marion," my father said, voice measured, "I see you've been busy." His tone carried more observation than judgment, a subtle acknowledgement that the house was no longer just a family convenience, but a carefully managed project under my control. Mom adjusted her scarf and paused near the porch, taking in the contractor's workstations and the clearly marked permits posted at the entrance. "It's impressive," she murmured, eyes flicking toward the visible documentation of scheduled deliveries and security logs. Her words were tentative, but they bore weight. This was not the gentle nudge of polite suggestion. It was the recognition of deliberate planning and authority she could not ignore. Ethan lingered nearby, arms folded, an awkward mixture of admiration and frustration on his face. Even Patricia, though still perched at the edge of impatience, allowed herself a glance toward the contractor's notes, the permits, and the clearly scheduled timeline. Her lips pressed together as she absorbed the consequences of assuming what was never hers to claim. I led my parents through the lake house, showing the spaces that had been gutted for renovation, the areas prepared for updates, and the floors and walls already stabilized after the flood damage. Their expressions shifted subtly from skepticism to reluctant acknowledgement. Each nod, each raised brow, each quiet murmur of approval was a step toward validating the authority I had long asserted but never fully claimed. "Years of careful work," my father said, finally. "And you've accounted for everything. I see that now." The words, while simple, carried decades of unspoken judgments and implied favoritism. The acknowledgement stung gently with the truth of past dynamics, but also reinforced the legitimacy of my choices. I let the silence linger as we stood in the open living area, the faint hum of construction around us. In that space, with every detail documented and every action intentional, the subtle shift in perception became palpable. The family could no longer assume control. Boundaries had been drawn, consequences established, and authority clearly exercised. 6 months later, the lake house had transformed into exactly what I had envisioned. The floors gleamed with freshly finished oak, reclaimed from the original structure and restored with care. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the lake, capturing every subtle ripple of water in the soft morning light. The rooms I had carefully redesigned reflected years of choices I had made for myself, color palettes that resonated with my temperament. Spaces that prioritized both function and serenity, and furniture positioned to honor the flow of natural light rather than anyone else's opinion. Friends arrived for a casual gathering, bringing laughter and warmth that filled the home. I poured wine from a bottle I had selected months earlier, served appetizers I had prepared myself, and watched as conversation flowed naturally. The house echoing not with entitlement or expectation, but with joy. Every corner, every beam, every deliberate choice was a reminder that this space belonged entirely to me. Later in the afternoon, my parents arrived. Linda and Richard stepped into the lake house, eyes wide as they took in the completed renovation. They walked slowly through the open spaces, nodding at the details with muted admiration. There were no suggestions, no attempts to influence or claim ownership, only acknowledgement of the careful planning, the execution, and the vision brought to life. My father's expression softened as he finally seemed to see the years of dedication and the firm boundaries I had maintained. Patricia's influence had faded from the conversation entirely. Even Ethan, standing nearby, had grown quiet, seemingly absorbing the reality that the lake house was no longer a place anyone could assume access to at will. I stood in the living room, watching sunlight dance across the reclaimed wood and thinking about the path that had led me here, the challenges, the insistence of others on claiming what wasn't theirs, and the constant need to assert my boundaries had all culminated in this moment. Peace wasn't granted by others. It had been earned through steadfast resolve, careful planning, and a willingness to act decisively. The lake house was more than a structure. It was a testament to autonomy, resilience, and personal growth. Each decision I had made, each obstacle I had faced, reinforced the knowledge that I could protect what mattered most without apology. In this space, I felt a quiet, unshakable satisfaction.